The 1980s were supposed to be Hollywood's golden age of blockbusters, but some of the decade's most daring films died at the box office. Studios buried ambitious projects that confused test audiences. Critics savaged movies that were too weird or too dark, and distribution nightmares killed films before they found their crowds. Decades later, these commercial disasters became the cult classics that defined a generation. The Right Stuff crashed and burned, despite being everything Hollywood loves. An epic about American heroes conquering space with a 3-hour runtime and a cast of rising stars. The film follows test pilots and the Mercury 7 astronauts from Chuck Yeager breaking the sound barrier to John Glenn orbiting Earth, chronicling how these men became instant celebrities while their families endured constant terror watching their husbands risk death for national glory. The Ladd Company and Warner Bros. Were gambling that post-Star Wars audiences were hungry for real space heroism, hoping Philip Kaufman's sweeping direction and a $27 million budget would deliver an Oscar-winning prestige picture that could dominate both critics and ticket sales. Dennis Quaid spent hours with the real Gordon Cooper to capture every mannerism and speech pattern, later admitting that knowing Cooper was alive and would see the film added crushing pressure to get it right. Mary Jo Deschanel stepped into the role of Annie Glenn almost overnight after another actress suddenly demanded more money and walked, forcing her to master Annie's famous stutter, despite having no idea how to portray it convincingly. Sam Shepard, cast as the legendary Chuck Yeager, initially saw the role as just another stoic outsider, until he learned how much Yeager's story mattered to the film's authenticity. When the film hit theaters, it bombed spectacularly, grossing only $21 million domestically because the 3-hour runtime and complex narrative clashed with blockbuster expectations. Critics actually respected the film on release, and it earned 8 Oscar nominations and won 4. But the commercial damage was devastating, with the movie disappearing from theaters within weeks. Today, it's preserved in the National Film Registry and considered one of the greatest American films ever made, but its journey from expensive flop to acknowledged classic took decades of cable airings and home video discovery. The Thing basically ended John Carpenter's career when he released the most nihilistic horror film imaginable, the same month E.T. taught America that aliens could be friendly. Kurt Russell plays helicopter pilot Mac Reddy, leading a doomed Antarctic research team against a shape-shifting alien that can perfectly imitate anyone it absorbs, creating a paranoia-drenched nightmare where trust becomes impossible and every blood test might reveal your best friend is now a monster. Universal was betting on Carpenter's post-Halloween hot streak to deliver a creature feature that could compete with summer blockbusters, hoping the combination of Russell's star power and Rob Bottin's groundbreaking practical effects would create a franchise-launching hit despite the dark tone. The production became famous for Richard Masur and the cast's unconventional rehearsal process, where Carpenter had everyone sit around a table talking through character relationships instead of blocking scenes, with these improvisational exchanges planting seeds for authentic moments throughout filming. The creative atmosphere exploded when Masur, David Clennon, and Thomas G. Waits forgot their microphones were live and spent 10 minutes cursing and criticizing Carpenter's strict vision, leading to a confrontation that paradoxically opened better dialogue between the director and his frustrated actors. When The Thing was released, critics absolutely destroyed it, calling the film morally corrupt and far too gruesome for mainstream audiences, with the graphic transformation scenes shocking censors so badly that some markets refused to show it or pulled it early. The backlash nearly ended Carpenter's Hollywood career, with studio heads losing faith in him and his reputation suffering for years as he got typecast as a director of disturbing, dangerous stories. Cable airings and VHS rentals throughout the late 80s slowly built a passionate cult following that recognized what critics missed, that Carpenter had crafted a masterclass in sustained dread where practical effects still look disturbingly real decades later. They Live might be the angriest movie ever made about capitalism, with John Carpenter casting professional wrestler Roddy Piper as a drifter who discovers special sunglasses that reveal society is secretly controlled by aliens hiding subliminal messages everywhere. Piper plays John Nada, a down-on-his-luck laborer who stumbles onto a resistance movement and teams up with reluctant co-worker Frank, played by Keith David, to destroy the alien broadcast signal that keeps humanity docile and obedient through commands like obey, consume, and submit, plastered across every advertisement and dollar bill. Universal was gambling that Carpenter's cult following and Piper's wrestling fame would attract young audiences to a sci-fi action movie, hoping the high-concept premise and relatively modest $5 million budget would make it a profitable B-movie hit regardless of critical reception. Keith David had spent years playing supporting roles and hesitated about stepping up to co-lead, but Carpenter wrote the part specifically for him and demanded he bring emotional fire to play opposite Piper's brash blue-collar energy. The production became legendary for the brutal 6-minute alley fight between Nada and Frank, with stunt coordinator Jeff Amada turning the cast parking lot into a practice ring where Piper and David rehearsed every punch and slam for weeks, sometimes for real, with one rule about nothing to the face, resulting in genuine bruises and aches that forged actual friendship off-screen. When They Live hit theaters, it made back its $5 million budget quickly, but was dismissed by critics as clumsy political satire, with too much wrestling and not enough substance, never becoming an immediate hit despite turning a profit. Video rentals and late-night cable transformed the film into an underground phenomenon, where its anti-consumerism message and quotable dialogue like, "I have come here to chew bubblegum and kick ass, and I'm all out of bubblegum," resonated with disaffected youth who felt the system was rigged against them, turning Carpenter's rage-fueled satire into a rallying cry that still gets referenced in protests and memes whenever economic inequality sparks public fury. Heathers turned teen movies into a blood-soaked satire that made everyone deeply uncomfortable, with Winona Ryder playing Veronica Sawyer, a girl desperate to escape the tyranny of 3 cruel popular girls, all named Heather, who rule her Ohio high school through gossip and social execution. When mysterious new kid JD, played by Christian Slater, arrives with dangerous ideas about punishing the popular kids, their pranks escalate into actual murders disguised as suicides, forcing Veronica to choose between being JD's accomplice and his violent crusade against toxic high school culture, or stopping him before he destroys everything. New World Pictures was trusting that the success of dark comedies like Beetlejuice meant audiences were ready for a satirical take on teen movies, hoping the combination of rising star Winona Ryder and edgy subject matter would create controversial buzz that could turn a small budget into major profits. Ryder's agent nearly refused to let her audition because the subject matter about suicide and murder could ruin her budding career, but she identified deeply with Veronica's pain and outsider status after being bullied herself, pleading to be considered and insisting she could bring the character's wounded humor and humanity to life. Christian Slater nearly lost the role after he thought his audition flopped and literally threw his script in the trash and stormed out, only to be shocked when casting directors called him back, leading him to channel Jack Nicholson's manic mannerisms to give JD his dangerous charisma. The production was plagued by offset drama, with Christian Slater dumping his then-girlfriend Kim Walker, who played Heather Chandler, to date Winona Ryder, creating genuine tension during their murder scene together. When Heathers premiered, it made modest box office numbers, but faced protests from parents groups about its portrayal of teen suicide, with some theaters refusing to properly market it and others pulling it early. Teenagers found the film through video rentals and passed it around like contraband, recognizing themselves in Veronica's struggle against social hierarchies and weaponizing its darkly comic dialogue as their own rebellion against adults who insisted high school was supposed to be fun, cementing Heathers as the film that dared to admit what everyone already knew about the cruelty lurking beneath pep rallies and yearbook photos. Clue took the most beloved board game in America and turned it into the weirdest comedy experiment ever attempted, with director Jonathan Lynn assembling an all-star comedy cast including Tim Curry, Madeline Kahn, and Christopher Lloyd to play guests at a murder mystery dinner party where everyone becomes a suspect. The film follows 6 blackmail victims summoned to a New England mansion where their mysterious host Mr. Body is murdered, forcing Butler Wadsworth, played by Tim Curry, to guide the increasingly panicked guests through the labyrinthine house as more bodies pile up, and multiple possible solutions emerge depending on which ending you saw. Paramount was predicting that the board game's massive popularity could translate into a franchise-launching hit, hoping the gimmick of releasing 3 different endings to different theaters would create buzz and repeat viewings, while the ensemble cast could appeal to comedy fans tired of formulaic story arcs. The production became famous for Madeline Kahn's legendary improvisation during the climactic confrontation, where she delivered the now iconic "flames on the side of my face" monologue completely unscripted, shocking director Jonathan Lynn, so much that he kept it in the final cut, despite the cast nearly breaking character in the background. Tim Curry's Herculean final act, where Wadsworth sprints through the mansion, reconstructing all the murders at breakneck speed, was shot mostly in a single day, with Curry delivering long stretches of dialogue while running up and down stairs for hours with almost no errors. The decision to film 3 different endings created genuine tension on set, with Martin Mull and Leslie Ann Warren worried their endings might be cut or that their characters would be remembered as villains. When Clue opened, audiences were completely baffled by the multiple endings, with critics debating whether the experiment was clever or a failed gimmick, leading to the film bombing at the box office and Paramount abandoning plans for a franchise. Cable airings let viewers marathon all 3 endings back to back, turning confusion into obsession as fans memorized the rapid-fire dialogue and discovered new visual gags on every rewatch, transforming a commercial disaster into a comedy masterpiece that gets quoted religiously and studied in film schools as textbook farce where every line and gesture lands with surgical precision. Once Upon a Time in America was Sergio Leone's 4-hour gangster masterpiece that Warner Bros. Absolutely butchered, following Robert De Niro as Noodles, a Jewish gangster whose childhood friendship with ambitious Max spirals into decades of crime, betrayal, and regret across New York's Lower East Side. The film weaves between 3 timelines showing Noodles and his gang as kids in the 20s pulling petty crimes, as Prohibition-era bootleggers drowning in violence and money, and as an older Noodles returning in the 60s to confront the ghosts of his past and the mystery of what really happened to Max. Warner Bros. Was betting that Leone's Dollars trilogy reputation, combined with De Niro's post-Raging Bull prestige, would create an Oscar-winning American epic, hoping the decade-spanning story and massive budget would position them as the studio willing to make auteur cinema on a grand scale. Elizabeth McGovern, playing Noodles' unattainable love, Deborah, found herself mentally and physically isolated from the rest of the cast during production, later admitting she felt miserably lonely in a way that made her scenes with De Niro painfully real. De Niro's commitment drove him to exhaustive research, traveling to neighborhoods where the real-life inspirations lived, and meeting with retired gangsters, gaining and losing weight for different timelines while requesting elaborate prosthetic makeup for the aged sequences. Leone fought fiercely against studio pressure to trim his nearly 4-hour original cut, believing every scene was essential to the emotionally complex story, but American distributors re-edited the film anyway, cutting over an hour and reshuffling scenes into chronological order that destroyed the narrative's dreamlike quality. When the butchered version premiered, critics and audiences were confused by the incoherent narrative, with De Niro declaring that viewers were robbed of the film's soul while Leone refused to attend US screenings. The film bombed spectacularly in its shortened American release, making back only a fraction of its $50 million budget and effectively ending Leone's career, though the extended cut eventually became required viewing for anyone serious about understanding how gangster films could transcend their genre limitations. Manhunter introduced Hannibal Lecter to movie audiences, and nobody showed up, with Michael Mann adapting Thomas Harris's Red Dragon into a stylish psychological thriller starring William Peterson as tortured FBI profiler Will Graham. The film follows Graham being coaxed out of retirement to hunt the serial killer known as the Tooth Fairy, forcing him to consult with imprisoned genius Hannibal Lecter, played by Brian Cox, while the killer Francis Dollarhide wages his own internal war between monstrous urges and a desperate romance with a blind woman. De Laurentiis' entertainment group was relying on the success of Thomas Harris's novel and Mann's rising reputation from Miami Vice to deliver a hit thriller, expecting that the stylish cinematography and psychological depth would appeal to adult audiences tired of slasher films. Tom Noonan, playing Francis Dollarhide, insisted on total isolation from cast and crew to build his character's warped psyche, refusing to meet co-stars before filming and asking everyone to call him Francis rather than Tom, creating such genuine unease that William Peterson later admitted their confrontation scenes were electrifyingly real. Peterson poured himself into portraying the psychologically fragile Will Graham at great personal cost, spending months researching real FBI profilers while isolating himself from friends and family, eventually suffering panic attacks and insomnia because he couldn't separate himself from Graham's haunted mindset. The crew grew so worried about Peterson's health that they offered counseling and more time off between harrowing scenes, with the actor later reflecting that the role nearly broke him, but he was proud of creating a hero whose vulnerabilities became as devastating as his strengths. When Manhunter premiered, many audiences and critics recoiled at its bleak portrayal of serial murder and clinical atmosphere, though some praised the performances, with protests accusing it of glamorizing evil and several theater chains refusing to screen it in suburban areas. The film flopped in theaters, earning just $8 million on a $15 million budget and shutting down any hope for a franchise. But it found a second life on video, where cinephiles embraced Mann's restraint and psychological complexity, arguing it outshone every later Hannibal adaptation. UHF became Weird Al Yankovic's passion project Disaster when he co-wrote and starred in this comedy about a hyperactive dreamer who transforms a failing UHF television station into a local sensation through bizarre shows like Stanley Spadowski's Clubhouse and Wheel of Fish. Al plays George Newman, whose creative chaos attracts a cult following, but also the wrath of ruthless rival station owner R.J. Fletcher, leading to a frantic telethon to save Channel 62 from being sold out from under them, while Fletcher sabotages everything, including kidnapping beloved janitor-turned-star Stanley Spadowski. Orion Pictures counted on Weird Al's huge music fan base, showing up for a feature film, hoping his quirky humor and parody style would spark a surprise comedy hit and launch him as a crossover movie star beyond his novelty song reputation. Michael Richards, years before Seinfeld made him famous, found total creative freedom playing Stanley Spadowski with such relentless improvisational energy that castmates couldn't predict what he'd do next, often running off-script and interacting with props and crew in ways that forced filmmakers to just let cameras roll and capture his unpredictable genius. Weird Al subjected himself to crushing pressure, co-writing and starring while juggling last-minute rewrites and prop edits, working late into the night and suffering crippling self-doubt during early test screenings when many jokes went over audiences' heads. The production was devastated when Trinidad Silva, who played animal show host Raul Hernandez, was killed in a traffic accident before completing his scenes, forcing quick script rewrites to address his absence and casting a shadow over the lighthearted production. When UHF premiered, it opened against Batman and Lethal Weapon 2, immediately bombing with only $6 million against its $5 million budget, with Weird Al admitting it was both devastating and freeing to learn the difference between fan adoration and mainstream acceptance, though his devoted fans kept the VHS in constant rotation and turned every absurd reference into inside jokes that proved cult classics don't need box office validation, when the people who love them refuse to let them disappear.